My name is Pamela. I'm an alcoholic. Pamela. My sobriety date is September 22nd, 1989. And I tell you that because that was what I was taught in the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous. But my life was very chaotic before I ever found the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous. And there's a whole bunch about why they told me I had to learn about my sobriety date. And we'll get to that as time goes on. I come from a family of teetotalers. My parents never drank. My grandparents never drank. I am one of 42 cousins from my father's 11 brothers and sisters, and no one drank in the family but me. I had never had examples of drinking. I didn't know what drinking was about, but I knew what it felt like to be frightened. And I knew what it felt like to be insecure. And I knew what it felt like to have that giant pit in your stomach where you don't belong, no matter what. The first memories I have of that is I'm like 3 years old, and I look in the mirror, and the wrong little girl looks back. I'm from Southern California. All my friends had blonde hair and blue eyes. I'm the little girl with red hair, green eyes, and zinc oxide on her nose. I did not belong, and that not belonging ate at me for the rest of my life. My father was a beekeeper, which meant we were like migrant workers. We traveled wherever the wherever the blooms were. My father took the bees to those fields. We went to apple orchards in Colorado. We went to alfalfa fields in Fillmore, Utah. We went to orange groves in California. And we traveled. In the 12 years of school, I changed schools 27 times. So I didn't have the stability, and because of that deep insecurity inside me, being the wrong little girl from the beginning, I began to be front row of every class I was ever in. I wanted to be smarter than. I needed to be important. I didn't know how else to fit. I didn't know how else to belong. And I pursued that for my entire life. Even in recovery for some time, I promise. I didn't drink until I was about 14, and like I said, I had no examples. And how I found alcohol is I went to other people's houses, and there were the babysitter people, the children that I sat, their parents, the alcohol was in their homes. And I learned I had a little pill bottle. And I learned I could take this little pill bottle and I could pour just a little bit of everybody's liquor out of their liquor cabinet, and I could take that pill bottle home and I could drink it. And the first time I ever did that when I was 14, it was magic. I ended up hiding in my closet because I was afraid my parents were going to find me. And I woke up with a horrible headache the next day. But the absolute relief and comfort that came to my inner soul from the relief of that drink made the whole next day better, made it like everything was okay with me. And I promise when I went to that, we had graduation for 9th grade, and when I went to that 9th grade graduation class, they had a bottle of wine, and my boyfriend and I were there, or my date and I were there, and that wine came to me, and I sucked on it as long and as hard as I could because I wanted that feeling. I remembered what it had been like. And I didn't babysit all the time, so I was only able to do that a couple of times, and then it was graduation, and then that wine was so wonderful and so great. But I'm such a wonderful, perfect alcoholic that we were in a 4-door vehicle, and at that time, the back seat of 4-door vehicles, because you have to realize I'm old, the back seat of 4-door vehicles was big enough for a person to sit on, and I drank so much of that bottle of wine that my date was sitting on the back seat, holding the door open with his feet while I could lay on the bench and throw out the door as we drove down the street. And I wanted to do it again. And the kind of guys I dated, he asked me out again. So that was the life I started to live at 14. Those kind of guys and those kind of places. And I continued to do that. I was a young mother. I was a mother by the time I was 17. I was a mother again before I was 18 and divorced before I was 19. And all that time, I drank when I could. because I didn't have it. It wasn't accessible. And my poor parents, I think about those sweet, wonderful, loving parents who never knew what to do with me from the very beginning. I was always that just over the top kid, that just a little too rambunctious, too precocious. I remember my dear sweet grandmother had this little poem, and she would say, there was a little girl who had a little curl right in the middle of her forehead. And when she was good, she was very, very good. And when she was bad, she was horrid. And that's you, Pamela. That's you. And I had that to live with. I'm already the wrong little girl. Now I'm horrid on top of it. I mean, give me a break. You'd drink over that, wouldn't you? But the truth was, they loved me. They loved me with all their heart. My parents were so gracious and so loving. And I'm raised in the 60s and 70s, and my parents go to a psychiatrist and don't send me because they don't want me to think there's anything wrong with me. Not quite the right message, but that's what they did. They were that kind, that loving, and that gracious. You know, years later I found a book, and it's about teenagers, and it's teenage children learn how to hug a porcupine. And that's probably what I was for my parents, you know. So, and I need to tell you, my life was very chaotic and charismatic along the way. And there were fun times, there were wonderful times, and there were absolutely terrible times. Those 3 ex-husbands are all wonderful men. They were absolutely, truly great men who could not live with an alcoholic. They went on to marry other wonderful women and stay married for long terms in their life. But that was not for my life. That didn't work for me. So I got to a place in my life where, again, education had become the thing that I could do well. So by the time I was 19, I had an associate degree in engineering. By the time I was 23, I had a chemistry degree. I continued to go on to college and pursue different degrees as I saw fit, because that was my validity. That was what was really important to me. If I could stay educated, if I could know enough that somehow, someplace along this path, that knowledge, that would be the one thing that I would finally learn that would make this puzzle in my life fit together. It would make me feel like I belonged. And along that path, I began to be a heavier drinker. And I have to be honest, my story is not about alcohol alone. My story is about multiple substance abuse, because I happened to live in a society when this was all happening, that those things were all prevalent. I'm from Southern California, which probably made it a little more prevalent for people who were raised in Utah. But that was part of my story. And I really thought that I did well when I didn't have a drink for about 7 years, because I realized someplace along there that alcohol was a problem in my life. Every time that I drank, I got drunk. And every time I got drunk, I got in trouble. And it wasn't just with the husband I had at the time, it was with other people. I mean, sometimes total strangers, because that was how I drank. And so I started to think that maybe if I could just leave alcohol alone. So for about 7 years, I did not drink. And I used plenty of other substances and didn't think that was a problem. I remember one time on some of those other substances, for some reason I was fascinated with gas chandeliers and gas hurricanes and gas lighting. And I almost burned our house down one Christmas Eve with my gas lamps, because I had just a few too many substances and couldn't quite wake up to turn them off. And we get up the next morning, and the house, if you know anything about gas chandeliers and gas lanterns, if they're too high, they put off this giant amount of soot. And we get up the next morning, and the house, the ceiling is covered in soot. All of the little children have these little clear lines around their soot noses. I mean, thank goodness we all lived through that. And I have to tell you, I have 5 absolutely beautiful, wonderful children who lived through that, and I love those children with all my heart. I would have never done anything to harm them. They were my life. They were my salvation. And I always wanted to be a mother. I wanted to have 12 children. And I always wanted to be a mom. And I would tuck those sweet little babies. I'd get them all washed and all cleaned up and their shiny little faces. And I'd sit them down in front of the DVD player and plug in a Disney movie. And I knew that Disney movie was 136 minutes. And I knew I could just go to the local bar for a little while. I could just have maybe a couple of drinks. And then I'd be home in time to tuck them in bed. And I would go to that bar, and I would have those little kids were sitting there, and I would have a drink. And I always sat at the bar so that I could leave early. Wouldn't try to sit at a table to invite any company or anything. Sit at the bar, and I'd look at that clock, and I'd go, okay, I have to leave at 8:25. And I'd look at the clock, and it'd be like 8:15, and I'd go, oh, okay, I can finish this drink. And I'd look at the clock, and it'd be 10:30. And I would go, what happened to the time? Where did it go? Or I wouldn't remember to look at the clock at all. And I wouldn't even go home. I'd get too drunk, I wouldn't remember where I was. And I wouldn't go home to my own bed. And those little children were left alone. A 12-year-old boy to take care of a 2-year-old child. And that didn't just happen once in my life. That happened many times in my life. And I loved those children. I loved them with all my heart. But I didn't know what was wrong with me. I didn't know how to fix that. I didn't know how to be a better mother. I didn't know how to not be able to take care of them. I didn't know it was the first drink. I didn't know I was an alcoholic. And I happened to be fortunate enough to have a tragedy in my life. And that tragedy was truly fortunate. And I got sober for about 1.5 years after that tragedy. And I really determined that alcohol and drug-free life was where I was going to go for the rest of my life. I didn't know anything about Alcoholics Anonymous. Having a teetotaling family and a history of teetotalers, I had never been influenced or understood anything about alcoholism. Didn't even know what Alcoholics Anonymous was. Had probably heard about it, but really didn't have any concept of it. And so had no Alcoholics Anonymous. And for 18 months I stayed sober. And life was grand. I was home with my kids. I was moving on with stuff. I was pursuing another degree. I mean, that part just goes without saying. I continued to do that, till 1996. But the realities were, I enjoyed that. I loved it. I had so much fun. And then I got a different job. I changed careers and went to work for another company, a different set of people who didn't know me and I didn't know them. And I worked there for about 1 year. And then someone said, so-and-so is leaving the company. We're going here and here. Come to the farewell party. We're leaving work a couple of hours early and we're all going to the party. And I went, sure, that'd be great fun. And we got to the party and there was one of the new women that I had met and made friends with said, I've got some vodka minis in my purse. Let's put them in our lemonade. Not everybody else's. It wasn't Spike the Punch party. It was, let's put them in our lemonade. And I went, I've never had that before. Maybe that would be a really good idea. Vodka and lemonade sounded okay to me. And for the next 3 years, I never drew a sober breath. I never drew a sober breath for the next 3 years. So anyone who tells you this is a progressive degree, believe them. That this is growing and going inside you constantly and continuing, believe them. In those 3 years, I did things I never thought I would do. I had all the yets that I had never even thought about happen in my life. Fell down my own front stairs and broke my nose. Got bucked off a couple of horses. I mean, just stuff that I never thought I would ever do. And did it all drunk. And fortunately for me, that very same woman had learned from her psychologist about Alcoholics Anonymous. And she had gotten sober first. And she had called me one day, and this is how she'd gotten terribly drunk and had needed to go home and had had some tragic stuff at her home. And she called me at work and she said, I really need somebody to help me. Will you please come to an AA meeting with me? And of course, being the do-gooder and always supporting others, I went, absolutely, I'd love to. What is it? So I met her, and we went to an AA meeting together. And I don't think I heard anything. My head was so full of, what am I doing here? Oh, I'm such a good friend. I'm supporting this girl. This is great. We went to that first AA meeting, and she said, please come with me tomorrow. And she stood up and said, I'm an alcoholic. I need to get... And I went to meetings with her for about 3 weeks. And every day she got up, and every day I went home and drank and drugged. And every day she looked like she got better. Her eyes started to clear a little bit. And I remembered when I'd been sober just a little while before how great it had felt. But I couldn't figure out how you did it. Because when I went home, there was still the booze. When I went home, there was still the liquor store on the way. I remember one time and I tried during that 3 years, I tried really hard to get sober. And I remember one time I promised myself I was not going to drink. And I'd made it like 4 or 5 days. And I'm driving home from work and I'm saying to myself, I'm not going to drink. And I drove absolutely past every drinking place I'd ever been, every liquor store I'd ever been. And I finally saw a little corner store and I went, I can stop here for cigarettes and milk. That was all I was stopping for. And as I got out of my car, I started to think maybe I could have a beer. And then by the time I got to the door, I said, I'm going to make it a tall one. And by the time I'd walked into that store, picked up milk, and walked to the front of that counter, I had a cold case in my hand. I bought my cigarettes, I bought my beer, I bought my milk. I went and sat in my car, and the first thing I did was pop that cold case open and drink one in the parking lot. And I heard somebody talk about that in a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I went, I am one of them. This is what I do. But I couldn't figure out how to not do it. And I was in a meeting one day, and someone, in all these meetings that I'd been in that 3 weeks, not always did I do the things they talked about, but I always felt the way they talked about. I felt the emptiness. I felt the loneliness. I felt the despair. I felt lost and didn't know why. And one guy stood up in a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous, and he said, the way you do this is you don't drink between the meetings, and you go to enough meetings to stay sober for 24 hours. And he says, sometimes you can only do that an hour at a time, and then you go back to another meeting. And if you can't do it for an hour at a time, you hang around the clubs, because there's clean and sober people in those rooms, and you can talk to them. And I heard that. And that was the first heard I conceived and said, I can do this. And that was a Friday afternoon meeting at the Alano Club. And that Friday was the Friday he picked up the kids, and he had the kids for the weekend. And I went back to work, and I left work, and I went back to the Alano Club for a 6 o'clock women's meeting. I stayed at the Alano Club and had dinner. I went to a 7:30 meeting and a 9 o'clock meeting, and that was actually when the Alano Club was open 24 hours a day. So they had a midnight meeting, and I stayed for that midnight meeting, and then I went home. And I got up the next morning, and I went to the meetings all day long Saturday. And I had been sober. And I realized it Saturday afternoon at the 5:15 meeting at Fellowship Hall when it was still on Richard Street. And I went, I've been sober all day long today. And I went home that night sober still. And I got up the next morning and went to and Sunday is the armpit of the week for meetings, I promise. It's terrible. Well, not enough meetings to keep you sober if you got to do it hour by hour. But I stayed sober, and the kids came home about 5 o'clock at night. I was able to get them all ready for bed, make sure everybody's homework was together, make sure everybody had school clothes for the morning. For the first time in so long, I couldn't remember when. And I'd gone to 17 meetings in those hours. And I had stayed sober intentionally for 3 whole days. And that was the beginning of my sobriety. And I did that because someone else needed me, not because I thought I had a problem. I did that because someone else invited me, not because I found my way here. And I did that because someone else told me what to do, and I listened. And that's how my recovery continues to be today. I went to a meeting every single solitary day for 6 solid years. I never missed a meeting. I traveled with work a lot, and I know that's a detrimental thing to do often. When you travel with work, you're with a whole bunch of different people, and they don't know you, and you don't want them to know you. Because deep in your heart, I don't care how long you've been here, there's always that fear that if you really knew me, you wouldn't like me. We're always just a little bit afraid. I don't think any of us ever totally outgrow that fear. You know, I'm scared to death to be here to speak to you tonight. That's who I really am. But I don't want you to know I'm afraid. I want to be looking good up here. I want to be impressive, you know, but scared to death inside, you know, asking for guidance and direction that I might hear what I might be able to say, what you could hear. Because what somebody else said to me that I heard made all the difference in the world in my life. But the bottom line is, it just happens one day at a time. And so for me, that's what early sobriety was like, one day at a time. And I happened to be fortunate enough that I got into a home group. It's called Friday Night No Nonsense Group out in Sandy, Utah. And when I started that home group, there were 5 guys and me. And these guys were old. They all had gray hair. I've been in this program 35 years. I was much younger then, I promise. I still have red hair because Miss Clairol still comes in a box, you know. But the bottom line is, they all had gray hair, and I thought they were really, really old because they all had long-term sobriety. The youngest guy in that room, still with gray hair, had 5 years sober. It was amazing to me. They had like 17 years and 14 years and 22 years. And that was just so unbelievable to me at 3 months sober. And I started to go to that group every single night and every Friday night. And you know what they did when I was 3 months sober? They gave me the keys. And they told me, you get to come and you get to unlock the doors and start the coffee for us on Friday nights. And of course, I was needed. Somebody needed me again. And I was willing to show up. I really became a member of Alcoholics Anonymous, I think, the first day, not just when I stood up and said I was an alcoholic, but when I stayed after and cleaned the ashtrays and put the chairs back and took the coffee cups back to the kitchen. Those are the times when I really started to belong here because I had a purpose. And I always knew that I needed a purpose. That was why I wanted those 12 kids, so I would have a reason. Because I wasn't enough inside to have a reason. This person wasn't enough. But if somebody else needed me, I'd be okay. And those old guys sat around that little kitchen table on Friday nights, and they talked about their recovery. And they talked about the first step until I got the first step. And that's how they taught me about Alcoholics Anonymous. But I was clever. And you guys have to know, I'm an educated girl. And so I would read the big book, and I would memorize a little passage out of the big book. Things like, the world would rest satisfaction and happiness if only I managed well. I would memorize those little quotes, you know, and I would spout them off in this Friday night meeting. And they would just smile and look at me and say, keep coming back. And they would talk about stories of powerlessness. They would talk about driving to liquor stores and not being able to walk out the door. and thinking you were only going to stop for a drink or two. They would talk about pulling into 7-Elevens or liquor stores and not being able to leave the parking lot until you had a drink. They would talk about the unmanageability of your life, that coulda, woulda, shoulda, if only, that I lived in all the time. And they would talk about that and say, it's just unmanageability. And then they would talk about, until they found that I really understood it, they would continue to talk about those things. I have to tell you, that Friday night meeting still talks about the first step a lot. Because it took them a long time for them to figure out that I really understood the first step. So they talked about it a lot. And then when I got to that place where they thought I had a good enough concept of the first step, they went to the second step and talked about trusting God is between a hard place and a rock. And you simply have to decide. You simply have to make a choice. You don't want to stay crushed in that place forever. Give your heart and your mind a chance to do something different. And then they talked about it was just making a decision, that your higher power could be anything you wanted it to be. And because I came from the family that I came from, I was really afraid God was way mad at me. The God I grew up with was never going to forgive me. So I believed in the wind. The wind was a power greater than me. And the wind I could feel in my face. And I could say, oh, are you going to walk against the wind today, Pamela? Or are you going to turn your back and let the wind push you? Are you going to let this happen in your life, or are you going to resist? And that worked for me. That gave me the opportunity to feel like I was part of this one more time by giving me choices. I don't think I'd ever made a choice. I made the decision to drink, and the decision to drink made all my choices past that from age 14 on. I didn't make choices. I survived. And now I could make a choice. I could make a choice to have a higher power. I could make a choice to come to these meetings. I could make a choice to listen and implement the things I heard. It was already talked about. I have no original ideas. Someone else has already heard it. Someone else has already said it. It's all been here before. I'm just telling you in my way. And so that power greater than me began to evolve. And then I had the opportunity to go to that same Women's Big Book retreat when another woman presented it. And there's a woman in this room who was there at that time, at that very first retreat with me. And I have to tell you, I was really frightened to go and very belligerent about it. But I went with all resistance and absolutely loved the material that was provided for me. That woman became my sponsor. She walked me, she was my big book sponsor, and walked me through the steps of the Book of Alcoholics Anonymous, and I will be eternally grateful for the rest of my life to that woman. Eternally grateful. I went to that big book retreat again the next year, and the next year, and the next year. I volunteered to be on its committee. I'm still doing, by the time then, I'm doing GSR work in my home group. And I promise, my group was called the No Nonsense Group. And when we had to do those big votes, I was always the descending vote. And I would have to walk up to that podium, and here I am, and I'm thinking everybody's going to think this is... My group doesn't want to spend the money on that this year. And I would be so frightened to say that. And then they'd talk about it some more and have another vote, and most of the time it still passed whether my group wanted to spend the money or not. But the bottom line was I got all those experiences, and I had all that support, and I had all that care and nurturing. It's like taking a little coal in your hand that's gotten so, all it is just barely a cinder, and you blow on it, and you blow on it, and pretty soon the light is so bright that it just starts to gleam. And that's what I felt like inside. I sold my soul to drugs and alcohol. I sold my soul. And Alcoholics Anonymous gave me the tools to have a soul. People loved me my whole life long, and I never felt the love because I'm an alcoholic. And I really believe I've sponsored a lot of women. I've worked with a lot of other women, and I'm a counselor, so I deal with a lot of women. I really believe that as an alcoholic, we don't know how to feel love. We know how to feel anger. We know how to feel resentment. We know how to feel fear. But love is a foreign thing for us. And we have to learn how to feel love so that we can let people love us. And the way they used to say that in my home group is, let us love you till you can love yourself. And they did. And you did. Even if your faces have changed, your love still feels the same in this room. It's always been like that for me. And in my recovery, I've been blessed enough. I had a sponsor for 17 years, and she passed away. I have another sponsor I've had for a lot of years since then. I've been absolutely blessed. I have to tell you, the first woman that I asked 3 women to sponsor me when I first got sober, and they couldn't. One of them had been diagnosed with cancer again. One of them had just gotten married. One of them had just gotten back to school. And so for my first year and a half in recovery, I had a male sponsor and a female big book sponsor. So I did all the things that you aren't supposed to do here, and a whole bunch of the things that you are supposed to do here. And my life has been absolutely amazing. My life has just been, I have 3 additional sons that I got in recovery, and they have never seen me drink. And they are wonderful young men. So I ended up with 8 out of my 12, which is just delightful for me. I have become a grandmother in recovery. I have 5 grandchildren. My kids all grew up and said, our house was so crazy, we're not going to get married or have kids. I went, okay, you guys choose. So I have 5 grandchildren, and I'm so blessed to have that. You know, my life is abundance beyond my understanding, if you can comprehend that. From that place of, it took me years and years to heal with my children. You know, it took a long time for them to forgive me and to believe that I would stay sober and that they didn't have to worry about me anymore. I was probably about 8 years sober the last time my children thought that, because I was very distressed and very upset when I came home one day, that I hadn't been drinking. They went, you're acting really strange. Are you doing drugs? And I went, no, I'm sorry, I'm not. I'm just had a really horrible day. So that fear doesn't go away from them for a long time. It took a long time to rebuild the relationship with my daughter. I was very distant to my grandchildren, but I did all the things she asked. I made appointments to go visit my grandchildren so that she could count on me. And I showed up on time. And I did exactly what she asked me to do. And I had to learn those things in these rooms. I had to learn those things from someone else who talked about them from a podium so I could learn how to do those things in my life. You know, I didn't know how to do those things. This program is exceptionally unbelievable, and my personal belief is everybody in the world would benefit if they did the 12 steps. But everybody in the world doesn't need to survive like I did. It was life and death for me. I didn't have a chance without those steps. I would never have been able to live this long or to have this joy. You know, I can stand before you today and tell you that my heart is full and my soul is healed because of the 12 steps of the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. I've learned how, when I came to these rooms, I held grudges. I was one of those kind of people who could end a friendship over a grudge. I could hold grudges for months at a time and not speak to people. This program taught me that that doesn't hurt them, it only hurts me. That the easiest words in my life today are, I'm sorry. What can I do to change this? You know, I've been given the gifts of so much abundance in my life. You know, a couple of times I was really mad at God because I wasn't rich and famous yet. But he just figured I had a different plan. And he was right. You know, my recovery has been amazing and wonderful and filled with gracious, loving people. And I'm truly thankful to all of you. You know, that home group still happens. You know, I've learned through prayer and meditation, as the book talks about, to be a better person than I ever thought I could be. I've grown to be compassionate and kind, and I never would have thought that I would have ever even wanted to be that. One of the things I complained the most about my mother was that she was too kind. She was such a nice, sweet mom, you know. I got to have some self-forgiveness. My parents never got to see me sober. My parents died before I got in recovery. And they never got to see me sober. But I got to learn some self-forgiveness. Because when I was about 2 or 3 years sober, I had just gotten through I had just said my prayers, and I had just done a little quiet meditation. And I had this overwhelming feeling inside me that my parents were okay with me, and that they knew I was sober, and that they were happy for me. And it was the strangest thing, because no one said those words. It was just a feeling I had. And I went, I'm forgiven. And I think that was the first time I was able to forgive myself, because I'd always felt like my parents were kind of mad at me because of who I was. And I was forgiven. I have to tell you, there are still some days when I wake up and I go, I'm still the wrong little girl. There are some times when I'm still afraid when new things come up or old things happen and I wish they didn't. And I still argue with my kids once in a while. I'm still as human as I ever was. But I have the gift of sobriety, and I have the grace of God in my life so that I can get through this one more day, one more time. And I thank you all from the bottom of my heart. I've become a woman I never thought I would. I've become the woman God created, not the woman Pamela thought she was supposed to be, or the woman Pamela thought you thought she was supposed to be, but the woman God created. And I thank you from the bottom of my heart for helping me do that, for being here to support me to continue to be that, and for celebrating and sharing my sobriety and my life with me. I thank you all humbly.